The first thing you need to understand is that I was there. I was sitting 3 rows back, in the curved observation seats of Lecture Hall 7 aboard the Concord of Mines, the most prestigious academic station in the outer reaches, when it happened. I had my datapad open, half my attention on the morning's syllabus, half my attention on the girl sitting alone in the front row. She was small. That's not an insult. That's just the first thing everyone noticed about her. She was small, even by human standards, and human standards were already something of a running joke in that hall. She had dark hair pulled back into a braid that was coming slightly undone at the edges, a faded gray jacket that was clearly too big for her shoulders, and boots that had seen better decades. She sat with perfect stillness, which should have been the first clue that something was different about her. But nobody was paying that kind of attention yet. Her name was Sira Voss. I only know that because it was on the enrollment board projected near the entrance. Second-year exchange student, human, from a place called the Cascades Reclamation Zone, which meant nothing to me at the time, and apparently nothing to anyone else either, because when the instructor called her name during roll, 3 vain students in the back row started laughing before she even opened her mouth. That's where I need to start, because what happened next, what happened over the course of that single class session, is something I've been thinking about every day since. The Concord of Mines was not technically a school. It called itself an institution of cross-species learning, which was the kind of phrase that sounded generous until you spent a few weeks inside it and realized what it really meant was, we let other species sit in our halls and learn from our scholars, and occasionally we acknowledge that they exist. The vein had founded it. The vein ran it. The vein filled about 60% of its student body, and the remaining 40% was distributed among 11 other species who had applied, been approved, and were quietly expected to be grateful. I'm Orith. My people are from the Shal cluster, not wealthy, not militarily significant, but considered academically acceptable, which is how I'd ended up with a seat in advanced theoretical xenobiology. It was a class about life systems and biological adaptations across species. It was also, as I would come to understand, a class about assumptions. The hall itself was beautiful in the way that vein architecture always was, high ceilings that curved inward like the inside of a shell, bioluminescent panels along the walls that shifted color depending on ambient temperature, seating arranged in a gentle spiral, so that everyone had a clear sightline to the central floor. The air was filtered to a crisp, neutral coolness that the vein preferred. Outside the long observation windows, you could see the slow rotation of deep space, the pale smear of a distant nebula, a few cold stars. When Sira Voss walked in that morning, she walked in late. Not disruptively late, maybe 40 seconds after the instructor had begun speaking, but in a vain academic environment, that was already a social crime. Every head turned. Every set of eyes tracked her movement from the doorway to the only remaining seat, which happened to be front and center, the kind of seat that exists in every classroom in every culture to punish latecomers. She didn't apologize. She didn't duck her head. She just walked to the seat and sat down, set her bag on the floor, and looked at the instructor with calm, attentive eyes. The instructor, a vain scholar named Drevitt, who had approximately 18 academic titles and the bearing of someone who had been told he was important since childhood, paused for exactly 3 seconds while looking at her. Then he turned back to the projection wall without commenting. In vein culture, that pause was the comment. The 3 students in the back row, I learned their names eventually, but I'll call them what everyone else called them, the cluster, because they were always together and always the loudest thing in any room, made a sound that I can only describe as a controlled snicker. It wasn't quite laughter. It was the vocal equivalent of a raised eyebrow. I remember one of them leaning toward another and saying, in vein that was clearly not meant to be overheard but was entirely loud enough to be, They let humans into advanced xeno now. And another one said, as long as it doesn't bring its pet. More laughter, quieter this time but spreading. I looked at Sierra Voss to see how she'd react. She didn't. She was writing something in a physical notebook, actual paper, with an actual pen, and her expression hadn't changed at all. That bothered me somehow, not in a bad way, in a way that made me keep watching. The first hour of the class was standard. Drevitt walked us through the assigned material, cross-species metabolic variants, specifically the difference in cellular regeneration rates between silicon-based and carbon-based life forms. He was a good lecturer, clear, structured, occasionally condescending, but knowledgeable enough that you could overlook it. He used the central projection space well, spinning three-dimensional models of cellular structures that you could almost reach out and touch from the front rows. Sierra Voss took notes the entire time, by hand, in that notebook. I watched her from my angle without being obvious about it. She wasn't struggling to keep up. She wasn't looking confused or lost. She was writing steadily, occasionally circling something, once drawing what looked like a quick sketch of one of the projected models with modifications that I couldn't quite make out from my distance. At the 40-minute mark, Drevitt paused his lecture and said he was opening the floor for questions and observations. This was standard practice. Students were expected to contribute. The cluster contributed first, as they always did. Lengthy, technically correct observations about metabolic variants in vein populations, delivered with the confidence of people who had been raised to believe that speaking first was the same as speaking best. A few other students contributed. An Orth student from my cluster, named Fenn, said something about comparative regeneration in deep-sea adapted species. A Marak student with blue-gray skin that shifted slightly in the bioluminescent light asked about variants in artificial environments. Then there was a pause. And Sierra Voss said quietly but clearly, "Can I ask something?" The room didn't go silent exactly, but it did that thing rooms do where the ambient noise drops slightly and people become more aware of what's being said. Drevitt looked at her with an expression that I can only describe as politely reluctant. "Of course," he said. She said, "The cellular regeneration models you're using, they're based on the Keth studies from about 40 years ago, right? The ones done on station populations." Drevitt said that was correct. She said, "I'm just wondering if those numbers account for gravitational variance. Because regeneration rates in humans change pretty significantly depending on gravity exposure over time. And if the Keth studies were done on station populations where artificial gravity varied between the test groups, the baseline might be off." Silence. Not the polite, academic kind of silence that follows a reasonable contribution. The other kind. The kind where a room recalibrates. Drevitt looked at her for a moment. "The Keth studies are considered foundational in this field," he said. "I know," she said. "I read them. I'm asking if the methodology accounts for gravitational variance. I don't see it addressed in the published papers." Another pause. "That," Drevitt said, in a tone that was careful in the way that sharp things are careful, "is a narrow concern." "Okay," Sierra said, and wrote something in her notebook. From the back, one of the clusters said, in that same not quite loud enough voice, "Humans criticizing foundational xenobiology. That's a new one." Quiet laughter. I looked at Sierra Voss again. She was still writing. Her pen moved steadily. Her expression was still calm. But her hand, I noticed, had shifted slightly. She was holding the pen differently now, wrapped in her fist rather than between her fingers, like she was holding onto something. I recognized that. It's what people do when they're trying very hard to keep a feeling inside. The second hour got harder. Drevitt moved into a section on behavioral adaptation, specifically, how different species developed cognitive and physical adaptations in response to environmental pressure. It was genuinely fascinating material. He walked through 3 case studies: vein sensory evolution in low-light environments, Marek skeletal reinforcement in high-pressure zones, and shall cluster respiratory adaptation in thin atmosphere regions. He did not include humans. When a student, not Sira, a Marek student named Torval, asked about human adaptive capacity, Drevitt spent approximately 45 seconds on it. He said that human adaptation was primarily technological rather than biological. He said that humans were, in the language of xenobiology, environmentally compensated, meaning that rather than adapting their bodies to environments, they adapted environments to their bodies. He said it without malice. That was what made it land the way it did. Because he was saying, in the precise vocabulary of his field, that humans didn't really adapt. They just built things. The cluster loved this. One of them, the tallest one, the one who always sat with his arms crossed like he was perpetually unimpressed, said, "Makes sense. Too fragile to adapt naturally." A few people laughed, not everyone, but enough. I looked at Sira. She had stopped writing. For the first time in 2 hours, her pen was still. She was looking at the central projection, where Drevitt had a rotating model of human skeletal structure displayed. A diagram meant to illustrate what he called baseline fragility in carbon-based bipeds. Her eyes were steady, but something in her face had changed. It wasn't anger. I don't think it was anger exactly. It was something quieter than that and somehow more serious. She raised her hand. Drevitt acknowledged her with a nod that was slightly too slow to be neutral. She said, "Can I ask what the comparison baseline is for fragile?" Drevitt said, "I'm sorry." "The diagram," she said, gesturing to the rotating human skeleton. "It's labeled baseline fragility. I'm just wondering what the comparison is." "Fragile compared to what?" Drevitt said, "Compared to most species in this room, frankly. Human bone density is significantly lower than vein. Human skin provides minimal protection against environmental hazards. Human respiratory systems are narrowly tolerant." "Right," she said. "But humans also have the highest pain tolerance of any carbon-based species in the documented register, and the fastest unconscious stress response time, and the ability to function under sustained physical and psychological duress that would incapacitate most other species. So I'm wondering if fragile is really the right framing, or if it's just describing one axis of a more complicated picture." The room was very quiet. Drevitt looked at her for a long moment. "Those are contested metrics," he said. "I have the citations if you want them," she said. "They're from Vane researchers, actually, published in the Concord's own academic journal." Another silence, longer this time. The tall one from the cluster said, with less amusement than before, "She brought citations." Drevitt cleared his throat. "We can discuss this after class if you'd like to share the references." "Sure," Sira said, and opened her notebook to a page near the back that was dense with small, neat handwriting. She had prepared for this. She had walked into this classroom already knowing what the material would say, already knowing where the gaps were, already carrying her counterarguments in a physical notebook, because she'd learned that in vain academic environments, people would dismiss a datapad citation as fabricated, but were less likely to dismiss a written page. I realized, sitting 3 rows back, that this girl had been here before. Not in this classroom, but in this situation, over and over, and she had learned to come prepared. Lunch break was 40 minutes. I eat fast, or if digestive systems are efficient. So I usually spent the second half of the break in the hall just watching the traffic of students and station personnel that moved through the main corridor outside the lecture halls. Ships were docking and departing at the far end of the station. You could hear the deep, pressurized thrum of the docking clamps through the walls if the corridor got quiet enough. I was sitting on a bench near the corridor window when Sira Voss walked past. She was carrying her lunch, something in a sealed container that she was eating while walking, the kind of practiced, efficient movement that said she was used to not having a lot of time. She stopped at the window nearby and looked out at the docking bays. I almost didn't say anything. But I'd been watching her all morning, and I felt like I owed her something, even if I didn't know what. "Your citations," I said, "they were real." She looked over at me. Her expression was careful in the practiced way of someone who has learned to assess strangers quickly. "Yeah," she said. "Drevitt knew they were real," I said. "That's why he didn't push back harder." She looked at me for another second, then said, "Orith right, shall cluster." "Cale," I said, "yeah. He'll assign a paper to the class next week that reframes the fragility argument without acknowledging that I raised it," she said. "It happens every time. I say something, and 3 weeks later it shows up in the curriculum as if someone smarter thought of it." She said it without bitterness, just matter-of-factly, the way you describe weather. "Does that bother you?" I said. She took a bite of her food. "It used to," she said. She looked back out the window at the docking bays. One of the large transport vessels was in the process of unloading, huge metal containers being moved by docking cranes, the mechanical arms moving with slow, deliberate precision. "Can I ask?" I said, and then wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. She raised an eyebrow. "What they said this morning," I said, "about the pet." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, something more complicated than that. "Yeah," she said. "What did they mean?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They mean CASS." "What's CAS?" She looked at me, and this time there was something very close to a real smile, though it was the kind of smile that comes with a lot of unsaid things attached. "You'll see," she said. "I put in a visitor clearance this morning. He'll be here by the afternoon session." She picked up her lunch container, tucked her notebook under her arm, and walked back toward the lecture hall. I sat there for a while after she'd gone, looking at the docking bays, listening to the distant mechanical heartbeat of the station. "You'll see." I didn't know why that made me uneasy, but it did. The afternoon session began at the 14th hour. I got back to my seat early, which was unusual for me. I told myself it was because I wanted a good angle on the projection wall. I didn't entirely believe myself. The hall filled slowly. The cluster came in together, still talking among themselves. Torval the Marak settled into his seat 2 rows from me. Fenn from my cluster sat to my left. A few other students drifted in, a Geth pair who always sat together, a lone Vresi who perpetually seemed slightly confused by the temperature of the room. Sira Voss came in exactly on time. She sat in the same front-center seat. She set her bag down, opened her notebook, and looked at the door. Drevitt began speaking. He was moving into simulation today, theoretical environmental scenarios, where students would work through adaptive responses to extreme conditions. It was the kind of session that relied heavily on the room's projection systems and occasionally required students to interact directly with the models. 20 minutes in, nothing had changed. Then the door opened. Not dramatically, it just opened. The standard mechanism, the soft pneumatic hiss of the lecture hall door. And everyone looked, the way everyone always looks when a door opens mid-class. What came through the door was not what anyone expected. I don't know what I had expected. A larger animal, maybe, something with teeth, something aggressive. That's usually what people imagine when someone from a rough background talks about a pet. What came through the door was a machine. Or not quite a machine, that's not right either. It moved like an animal. That was the first thing. It moved with the fluid, deliberate weight of something alive, 4 massive legs that absorbed each step without sound, a body that was somewhere between the shape of a large predatory feline and something that had been engineered well past what nature had intended. It was approximately 3 meters long and stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder, which meant it had to angle its head slightly to clear the doorframe. The surface of it was dark, not painted, just the natural color of whatever alloy comprised its outer chassis, and across that surface, in patterns that took a moment to resolve into coherence, were seams and panels and what might have been heat dispersal structures along the flanks. There were no visible weapons. There were no obvious threat displays. It simply walked in and oriented towards Sira Voss and sat. Like a dog sits, that same easy, patient fold of the haunches, except that when it settled, the floor actually resonated, not loudly, but you felt it. The room had gone completely silent. Not gradually, completely. Between 1 second and the next, every voice, every shifted weight, every soft data scroll sound from a dozen data pads simply stopped. Drevitt was standing at the center projection, and he had stopped mid-sentence. His mouth was still slightly open. His hands were in the position they'd been in when he was gesturing at a metabolic diagram, but they had ceased moving. The cluster, all three of them, were staring. The tall one who had made the fragility comment was staring with his mouth closed, but his eyes doing something I can only describe as recalculating. Sira Voss did not look at the room. She looked at the machine at CASS and said quietly and warmly, "Hey." The head of it turned toward her, and I mean turned, not rotated mechanically. Turned with that slight angle of attention that a living thing uses when it's focusing, and from somewhere in its chest came a sound that was absolutely not a mechanical noise. It was low, resonant, and it lasted maybe 2 seconds. It was, I realized with a strange feeling in my chest, something like a purr. "Good trip," she said. The head tilted. The sound came again, slightly different, and she nodded as if she'd received a full sentence. The silence in the room stretched. And then Drevitt said, very carefully, "Ms. Voss." "He has clearance," she said, still not looking up from CASS. "I filed it this morning. Visitor authorization, academic observation, non-combatant status." The station's security office approved it at the 13th hour. Drevitt looked as if he was trying to find the right response somewhere, in a very large and suddenly inadequate vocabulary. "What?" said the tall one from the cluster, and his voice had completely lost its earlier certainty. "Is that?" Sira Voss finally looked up. She looked at him with an expression that was entirely neutral, and she said, "This is Cass." "What is Cass?" She looked at the machine beside her, then back at the class. "He's my companion unit," she said. "Constructed autonomous support system. He's been with me since I was 7. Another silence, longer this time. "He was built," said one of the other cluster students, the one who was smallest and usually spoke least. "By who?" "By my father," Sira said, "and my mother and me eventually, when pieces needed replacing." The tall one said, That's a military-grade chassis." "Modified," she said. "Military grade is military grade. The original chassis was. Everything else is custom. He's not a weapon." She paused. "He's never been a weapon, actually. The weapons systems were removed before my parents had me. They wanted him to be safe to be around a child." The word child sat in the room like a stone, dropped into still water. I was watching the cluster, and I was watching CASS, and I was trying to process both at the same time. The machine, the companion unit, I corrected myself, was sitting with perfect stillness except for the faint rotation of what I now recognized as sensor arrays along the top of its skull. It was watching the room, watching everyone in it, with calm, methodical, total attention. Not threatening, but aware in a way that made every other awareness in the room feel slightly less complete. Drevitt recovered first, I'll give him that. "The visitor authorization is noted," he said, with the careful tone of someone deciding not to fight a battle they're not sure they can win. "Provided the unit remains non-disruptive, we can continue." He will, Sierra said. Very well, Drevitt turned back to the projection wall. Now, as I was saying, theoretical adaptive scenarios. But the class did not snap back to normal. It couldn't, because CASS was there, and CASS was not something you stopped being aware of once you'd started. He sat at Sierra's side and he breathed, not literally, but he cycled air through his systems in a rhythm that was close enough to breathing that your brain processed it the same way. And every few minutes the sensor arrays would sweep slowly across the room and then return to rest. I watch people try to pay attention to Drevitt and fail. I watch them drift, repeatedly, to the front row and the thing sitting in it. The cluster were quiet in a way I had never seen them be quiet before. The tall one had his arms uncrossed. He was leaning forward slightly. His eyes kept moving from the lecture projection to CASS and back. Torval the Marak, who was generally very composed, had shifted his seat 2 inches to the right without appearing to notice he'd done it. The Vresi student near the back had turned the color that Vresi turn when they're processing something they haven't categorized yet, a pale, uncertain gray. And Sierra Voss sat in her front center seat and took notes in her paper notebook with her pen, exactly as she had all morning. 40 minutes into the afternoon session, Drevitt moved into the simulation exercise. He divided the class into groups of 4 or 5 and gave each group a theoretical scenario, a novel environmental condition that a species would need to adapt to, with the task of working through what biological or technological changes would most effectively ensure survival. It was meant to be a collaborative exercise. It was meant to generate discussion. Sierra was assigned to a group with Torval Fenn and one of the cluster, the small, quiet one whose name I learned was Save. I was in an adjacent group, close enough to hear. For the first few minutes, the dynamic in Sierra's group was predictable. Torval and Fenn were careful, not unfriendly, but careful in the way that people are when they're waiting to see what the social temperature is going to be. Save said almost nothing. Sierra started working through the scenario with methodical, quiet efficiency, laying out variables in her notebook in a list. Their scenario was a species forced to survive on a world with nitrogen-dominant atmosphere that fluctuated between extreme cold and moderate warmth in rapid cycles, with limited access to liquid water and high UV radiation during the warm periods. Sierra said, "The UV is the main problem. Everything else is manageable with the right body plan, but UV at that level damages cellular repair mechanisms faster than most species can compensate." Torval said, "Subdermal melanin density increase. It's the standard Marak solution for high UV environments." "It works up to a point," Sierra said, "but the scenario says extreme levels. We're probably talking 10 to 20 times what melanin can handle in the long run." Fenn said behavioral adaptation, nocturnal shift, active during the cold cycles, dormant during warm. "That could work," Sierra said and wrote it down. "But the cold cycles are extreme. We'd need a solution for heat retention too." And then quietly from beside her came a sound. CASS made a soft noise. Not the resonant purr from earlier, something shorter, more specific. Sierra looked at him. His head was slightly angled. She looked back at the group. "He's asking if he can contribute," she said. Save the quiet one from the cluster said, He can. "He processes environmental modeling as part of his core function," Sierra said. "He's been running the scenario variables since Drevitt put them up." Fenn said a little carefully, "What's he saying?" Sierra listened to another short sequence of tones from CASS. Then she said, "He's pointing out that the scenario species doesn't need to solve UV radiation and cold retention as separate problems. If the species develops a phase-adaptive outer layer, something that thickens and insulates during cold cycles, and then tightens and densifies to reflective capacity during warm cycles, you solve both with one adaptation." He's cross-referencing with 3 species in the documented register that have partial versions of this, and suggests the full adaptation is theoretically achievable. A pause. Torval said, "What 3 species?" Another short sequence of tones. Sierra said, "Keth deepwater variants, Vresi alpine subpopulations, and the Shal cluster's own cold adaptation branches." She looked at Finn. "Your people, actually." Finn looked at CASS with an expression I can only describe as conflicted wonder. He knows Shal cluster biology. "He knows most things," Sierra said simply, and went back to writing. By the end of the simulation exercise, something had changed in that room. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't an announcement. It was the slow, quiet shift of a room's center of gravity, almost geological, the way a landscape changes not through explosion but through accumulation. Drevitt came around to check on each group's progress. When he reached Sierra's group and read through what they'd compiled, he was quiet for a long moment. "This is sophisticated work," he said. "CASS helped," Sierra said. Drevitt looked at the unit. CASS looked back at him with those sensor arrays in a way that was not aggressive but was completely, unhurriedly thorough. "The phase-adaptive layer concept," Drevitt said slowly. "That's," he stopped, cleared his throat. "I'd like this group to present their findings to the class." Sierra said, "Okay." "All of you," Drevitt said. And then, almost as if someone else was speaking, he said to CASS, including him. The sensor arrays tilted slightly. The per-sound came again, brief and warm. I think that was the moment, not the entrance, not the silence when CASS first walked in. This was the moment, when Drevitt, with all his academic titles and all his instinctive reluctance, addressed a machine that a human girl had been building since childhood as if it deserved the acknowledgement. Because it did. The presentation was 15 minutes long. Sierra talked. Torval contributed 2 sections. Finn expanded on the Shal cluster comparison. Save, the quiet one from the cluster, the one who had been part of the morning's laughter, said exactly 1 sentence, and the sentence was, "The system CASS modeled has precedent in existing biology, which means it's not theoretical. It's achievable." And CASS stood at Sierra's side throughout, and when she referenced his modeling, he would produce the relevant tonal sequence and she would translate and the room would listen. And by the end of it, the listening felt different than it had at the beginning of the day. The tall one from the cluster, the one who had said too fragile to adapt naturally, was in the front of his seat the entire time. At the end of the presentation, he asked a question, a genuine question, in a tone that had lost all its earlier armor. He asked, "How does CASS translate cross-species biological data into environmental modeling? That's not a standard function even in advanced research units." Sierra looked at him for a second, and I could see her deciding something. Then she said, "My mother was a xenobiologist. She spent 11 years traveling before I was born, cataloging adaptive biology across about 30 systems. She uploaded everything she documented into CASS's primary memory as part of his base training. So he grew up with it." She paused. "Same as I did." Silence. "Where is she now?" the tall one asked, and then quickly, like he'd realized it might be too much, "You don't have to." "She died when I was 9, Sierra said, simply, without drama, ship failure in the outer reaches. My father kept adding to CASS's memory after that. He said it was a way of making sure her work didn't disappear." She looked at the unit beside her. "CASS has never met her, but everything she ever learned is in there." "So in a way he has." The room was very quiet. Not the same kind of quiet as when CASS had first walked in. That was the quiet of shock. This was the quiet of something landing somewhere deep and rearranging things on the way down. I looked at the cluster, all 3 of them. The tall one had his eyes slightly averted, the way people do when they're feeling something they weren't prepared to feel. The third one, who I'd barely noticed all day, was looking at CASS with an expression that I could only call reverence. CASS, for his part, had turned slightly towards Sierra at the mention of her mother. Just slightly. Just barely perceptibly. The sensors had stilled, and the low, resonant sound came again, not the brief communicative kind but the sustained, warm kind. Like comfort. Like acknowledgement. Like the sound of something very old and very patient saying, "I remember. I always remember." Drevitt closed the session 10 minutes late. He never did that. His punctuality was legendary, but he didn't seem to notice the time had passed. At the end, as students were gathering their things, he stood at the front of the room for a moment and said something that I've thought about many times since. He said the Keth studies. He was looking at the projection wall, not at anyone in particular. The question raised this morning about gravitational variance in the methodology. I'll be reviewing the relevant papers before next week's session. It's a valid concern. He didn't look at Sierra when he said it, but she nodded just barely when he said it. And that was enough. I caught up with Sierra in the corridor afterward. CASS was with her, which meant the corridor gave them a fairly wide berth. Students and station personnel flowed around the two of them like water around a stone, not frightened exactly, but instinctively respectful of the space. CASS, I said, because I felt like I should address him directly if I was going to talk about him. The sensor arrays turned toward me. His name is really Cass, I said to Sierra. That's what the acronym is, she said, but that's not why I call him that. I started calling him Cass when I was 3 because I couldn't pronounce the full thing, and it stuck. Does he? I tried to figure out how to phrase it. Does he understand everything that's said around him? Most things, she said, across about 40 languages. His translation matrix is pretty old, but my father updated it regularly. Does he? I stopped again. She waited. Does he get lonely? I said, when you're in class and he's on the ship. She looked at me for a moment, and something softened in her face. He reads, she said. He's connected to about 6 different academic archives. He reads constantly. She paused. And he remembers everything. So when I come back, I tell him about my day, and he already knows the context for everything I describe. It's like, she thought for a moment. It's like talking to someone who's already done all the background reading. I said, does he know what it's like to be laughed at? She was quiet. He's been with me for 15 years, she said. So yes, he knows. She put her hand on CASS's flank briefly, not a command, just a touch. The way you touch something you trust. The great machine was still for a moment. Then it moved, slow and fluid and without any sound at all, and its head dipped toward her in a gesture so small and so unmistakably intentional that it didn't need any translation. Come on, she said to him softly. Let's go home. And they walked down the corridor together, the girl with the worn boots and the coming undone braid, and the enormous dark machine that carried a dead woman's life's work in its memory, and had learned over 15 years to be something that did not have a name in any language I knew. Something like family. End of part 1. Part 2. 3 weeks. That's how long it took for things to change, and also how long it took for things to get worse before they changed for real. I need to tell you both parts, because the second part doesn't make sense without the first. The 3 weeks after the lecture hall incident were strange. I'd been at the Concord of Minds for 2 years by then, and I knew its rhythms the way you know the rhythms of any place you've lived in long enough. The cycles of social pressure, the way reputation moved through a community, the unspoken architecture of who deferred to whom and why. What happened after Sierra Voss's afternoon session with CASS was that the reputation architecture shifted. Not everywhere, not completely, but enough that you could feel it if you were paying attention. The cluster stopped making noise about her. Just stopped. The three of them were still around, still together, still occupying their usual social space, but the easy confidence they'd had before had developed a hesitation around its edges. When Sierra walked into a room now, the tall one, whose name I'd finally learned was Dren, would occasionally look up, and then look at his datapad and not say anything. That sounds small. In that context, it was seismic. Drevitt did, in fact, revisit the Keth studies in the next week's session. He didn't announce it as a revision. He just integrated a new section on environmental variance in station-based research methodology, and he referenced two papers that directly addressed the gravitational inconsistency that Sierra had raised. He never said her name, but Fenn, sitting beside me, leaned over at one point and said very quietly, "She was right then." "She was right from the beginning," I said. Fenn was quiet for a moment. Then, why didn't he just say so? "I thought about that." "Because," I said, "the studies being right is safe. The girl being right is complicated." Fenn didn't say anything else, but I saw him writing something in his notes. CASS came to 2 more sessions over those 3 weeks. Each time, Sierra filed the clearance the morning before, and each time the unit would arrive quietly at the beginning of the session and sit at her side for the duration. Each time, the room recalibrated to his presence a little faster. By the 3rd visit, there were students who said hello to him, not to Sierra, directly to CASS, when they came in. And CASS, who missed nothing and forgot nothing, had apparently begun to recognize individual voices, because his sensor arrays would orient specifically toward whoever was speaking to him. Torval started bringing questions to Sierra's group. Not assigned questions, voluntary ones, things he'd been working through on his own and wanted another angle on. He would come in before class started and slide into a seat near her and say, "Can I ask CASS something?" And Sierra would look at the unit and CASS would tilt his head and produce a brief permissive tone that Sierra had once told me meant roughly of course. So things were improving. Which is exactly the point in a story where something decides to get difficult. The problem arrived in the form of Commander Veth. Veth was not a scholar. He was vain military. Specifically, he was the station's senior security officer, a position that carried a great deal of unofficial weight at an institution that presented itself as peaceful and academic, but operated within a military-adjacent framework that it preferred not to discuss too loudly. I saw him for the first time in the main corridor during the 4th week, walking with 2 junior officers and moving with the particular kind of purpose that security people use to signal that their purpose is more important than yours. He was tall, even for Vane, and he wore his rank markers on a uniform that was deliberately austere. No unnecessary insignia, nothing decorative, the kind of presentation that says, "I don't need to show you what I am." He stopped outside the administration office and spoke with someone I recognized as one of the station's senior administrators. I wasn't close enough to hear the conversation, but I saw the administrator's expression change about halfway through it, and the change was the administrative equivalent of someone swallowing something they'd rather not have swallowed. I found out from Fenn, who had a friend in the administrative support staff, what the conversation was about. Commander Veth had filed a formal inquiry regarding the presence of a Class IV autonomous military-adjacent unit on a civilian academic station. The inquiry cited 3 regulations, 2 station security protocols, and a galactic Concord framework regarding the transportation of decommissioned military hardware across academic and diplomatic zones. The visitor clearance that Sierra had filed and that the station security office had approved was being reviewed, retroactively. I told Sierra the next morning. She was in the corridor outside Lecture Hall 7, 20 minutes before the session began, eating the same kind of sealed lunch container that she always seemed to have and writing in her notebook. Cass was not with her. He was on her ship, which was docked at Bay 14 on the lower tier. She looked at me when I told her, and her face did that thing again, the stillness that wasn't emptiness, the careful containment of something larger than what she was showing. "I expected this," she said. "You did." "Not specifically Veth, but something like it." She looked at her notebook. "CASS is flagged everywhere we go. It's been happening since I started traveling with him. Someone always notices the chassis classification and files something." "What happens when they file something?" "Depends on the station. Depends on the jurisdiction. Depends on," she paused. "Depends on whether anyone is willing to look at the actual history of the unit rather than just the original hardware classification." "What is the actual history?" She set her notebook down, looked at her hands for a moment. "CASS was built for a mining operation in the outer reaches," she said. "He was a security unit. The chassis was designed for hostile environment patrol. He was operational for about 3 years before the company that built him went under. My father bought him at an asset auction for almost nothing because everyone else at the auction was looking at the specs and seeing a decommissioned military chassis and thinking liability." "What did your father see?" "A machine that had spent 3 years doing security work in a dangerous environment and had never, in any incident report, harmed a living thing when any other option was available." She paused. "There were 17 incident reports across 3 years. In 4 of them, a human worker was in physical danger and CAS intervened. In 13 of them, CASS used physical barriers or warning systems to resolve situations without contact." She looked up at me. "My father was a careful reader. He read all 17 before he made the bid." I was quiet for a moment. "The weapons systems," I said. "You said they were removed." "Before I was born. My father spent 8 months on it. Cass was off for that entire time. My father said it was the quietest 8 months of his life." A small pause. "He also said they were the worst 8 months of his life." Something in the way she said that told me a lot about her father. "So CASS remembers," I said. "The weapons, does he?" "He has the memory of having them," she said carefully. "He has no capability and no function in that direction anymore. It's like," she searched for an analogy, "it's like if you had a very thorough memory of learning to walk, and then someone permanently changed your anatomy so that walking wasn't possible. You'd remember learning. You'd remember what it felt like to be capable, but you couldn't do it." "Does that bother him?" She looked at me with an expression that was steady and honest. "I asked him that once," she said. "When I was about 12, I asked him if he missed having them." She paused. "He was quiet for a while, and CASS doesn't do quiet unless he's processing something real. And then he made a tone I hadn't heard before. I didn't have a translation for it, so I asked him to describe it. And she stopped. "He showed me a visual. He projected an image. It was a picture of me at about 3 years old, sitting on his back. He was much shorter then, before my father modified the leg structure, and I had both arms out and I was laughing." She was quiet. "So, no, he doesn't miss them." I didn't say anything for a while. "What do you do about Veth?" I finally said. "I go to the hearing," she said, "and I bring the documentation." The hearing was 2 days later, in the station's administrative chamber, a smaller, less beautiful version of the lecture hall, with lower ceilings and more severe lighting. Functional space rather than academic space. I wasn't supposed to be there. But Fenn had a friend who had a friend who let 2 Orth students stand in the back near the environmental monitoring station, which was technically a different room, but had an open access panel through which you could hear everything. Veth was there in his deliberate uniform, with 2 officers beside him, and a data panel with the full incident report loaded. Sierra was there with her notebook, wearing a slightly better jacket than usual. The jacket was still too big. I think it was her father's. CASS was not there. The access ramps to the administrative section didn't accommodate his profile, so she was alone. Alone and prepared. Veth made his case first. He was precise, methodical, and clearly accustomed to winning administrative hearings. He walked through the chassis classification, the regulations, the security protocols, the Galactic Concord framework. He spoke for 14 minutes and cited 11 distinct provisions. At the end, he said, "The presence of this unit constitutes a security risk to the station's population and a breach of the academic sanctuary protocols under which the Concord of Mines operates." He sat down. The administrative officer, an older Vane named Soren, who had the tired eyes of someone who had been managing competing institutional interests for decades, looked at Sierra. "Ms. Voss," she said. Sierra stood up. She spoke for 22 minutes. I timed it. She addressed every provision Veth had cited. Not in a sweeping, emotional rebuttal, methodically, one by one, the way you work through a checklist. She had the legal texts. She had the historical context for each regulation. She had documentation of CASS's modification history, certified by 3 different independent engineering assessors across 2 systems. She had the 17 incident reports from the mining operation, with her own annotations marking the relevant decision points. She had CASS's maintenance logs going back 15 years, which showed his behavioral modification history in granular detail. She had at the back of her notebook a single page that she saved for last. "The Class IV designation," she said, "refers to the original chassis and its manufacture date. It does not describe the current configuration of the unit, which has been verified by 3 certified assessors as non-weapons capable and behaviorally modified to a standard that exceeds the safety requirements for civilian and academic environments." She set the page on the table. "The relevant Galactic Concord provision, the one cited in Commander Veth's submission, allows for reclassification of autonomous units when modification is verified and documented. The documentation has been filed with the Concord's own registry for 6 years. Cass is not a Class IV unit under current law. He's a Class I companion unit with a legacy chassis." "Silence," Veth said. "Class reclassification requires review by a military-grade assessor." "I know," Sierra said. "The assessment was conducted by a retired Vane military engineer named Hesov, who was, until 3 years before her retirement, the lead assessor for the Galactic Concord's own autonomous unit registry." She turned the page over. "She signed the reclassification 7 years ago. Her credentials and contact information are on the back." Long silence. Soren, the administrative officer, looked at Veth. Veth looked at the page on the table. Veth looked at Sierra. And Sierra Voss stood in her too big jacket with her paper notebook and her calm, prepared eyes, and did not say another word, because she had learned long ago that the best argument is one that doesn't need you to keep arguing after you've made it. The ruling came 2 days later. CASS's visitor clearances at the Concord of Mines were approved on an ongoing basis, contingent on continued good conduct. The security inquiry was closed. I heard about it from Finn before Sierra could tell me. I went to find her. She was in the docking bay, Bay 14, lower tier. She was sitting on the loading ramp of a small, older model transit ship with her boots off and her feet on the warm metal of the ramp, and CASS was beside her in the way that he was always beside her, present, quiet, aware. "You heard," she said when she saw me. "Finn's network," I said. She nodded. "How long did you know about the Class I reclassification?" I said. "Since I was 16, she said. "My father did the original reclassification when I was 12. Hesov, the assessor, she'd worked with my mother years earlier. She agreed to do it as a favor." She looked at her hands. "My father said that the reclassification was partly practical and partly. He wanted there to be a document that said officially, on record, what CASS actually was. He said he didn't want CASS to be defined forever by what he was built to be." I sat down on the ramp beside her. CASS's sensor arrays drifted slowly across the docking bay, tracking the movement of dock workers and machinery with the same calm, unhurried attention he gave to everything. "What happens now?" I said. "We stay," she said. "Finish the year." She paused. "Maybe the second year too, we'll see." "And Dren," I said, "and the others." She was quiet for a moment. "Dren asked me yesterday," she said, "if he could bring his study notes to CASS to review for the end-of-term assessment." A pause. He was very formal about it, very precise, like he'd practiced what he was going to say. "What did you say?" "I said CASS would be happy to help." She looked at the unit. "I said he'd probably enjoy it. He loves this stuff." As if on cue, though there was no cue, only the perfect contextual timing of something that had spent 15 years learning to read a moment, CASS made the low, warm, resonant sound. The purr. Sierra smiled, really smiled this time, the kind that reached everything. "He says he's looking forward to it," she said.